and going now to Rushanara, please.
Good afternoon. So before I go on to climate change and financing net zero, I had a couple of quick-fire questions following up from colleagues. Chancellor, in response to Angela Eagle's questions on the NHS, you mentioned that there's about £55 billion set aside. You promised that you would provide the NHS whatever they needed. They are saying that they're going to have to make about £8 billion worth of cuts within weeks if they don't get that money. Can you tell us if £8 billion will be made available to them at the beginning of the next financial year, yes or no?
So what I wouldn't do is comment in public about conversations that we have inside with departments to figure out exact funding requirements for next year. What I can tell you is we are providing the NHS with an enormous amount of extra resources. I don't know, Dan, if you've got the breakdown of how much we've already provided, but just at budget, we announced another £1.6 billion for the NHS for the vaccine rollout, for example. And obviously we have provided tens of billions of pounds of additional funding both over last year and this.
I want to say it's 112 billion, but I will check.
We'll check. So, but with regard to funding for next year, whether that's with the Department of Health, the Ministry for Housing, Community, Local Government, or others, we have those conversations all the time to make sure that we can get funding to where it's needed.
So I think they'll want to know. I mean, the Red Book sets out that there's a £7 to £8 billion in the first half of 2021-22. So I think we'll all want to be assured that you'll be able to do whatever it takes to help them, so that they're not having to make cuts. Can we have that assurance at least?
As I said, I wouldn't comment on individual department conversations, but I think £407 billion of financial support for the country over last year and this year, I think would demonstrate that we are doing an enormous amount to support public services, businesses, and people through this crisis, and it stands as a very comprehensive and very significant amount of support.
So we're not going to get specifics, but I hope you manage to resolve this issue, because it's £8 billion is a lot of money, and that it will mean cuts if it's not resolved. On gender, in relation to the question my colleague Harriet asked you, the extra 19 million that's been provided to women's refugees is obviously very welcome, but Women's Aid has identified that they need 393 million. As we speak, our colleagues are speaking in the International Women's Day debate. We had International Women's Day on Monday. My colleague Jess Phillips is reading out the names of women who've been killed in the last year. And each year she has the grim task of doing that. Do you think that given that in the pandemic in the last year, the level of violence against women has gone up dramatically, do you think that this is a moment that you should be increasing the budget and providing the amount that Women's Aid has called for? And in those discussions with departments, will you consider doing that, Chancellor?
That's why I think you're absolutely right to highlight the impact, the increase in domestic violence through the pandemic. Right? It's one of the costs of what we're doing when we talk about all the different costs of lockdowns and the difficult decisions that have to be made. You're right to highlight that this is something that has happened as a result of people being locked down. So, and that's why at spending review in November we provided an extra £125 million for domestic violence to support all the ambitions in the domestic abuse bill, which supports victims and their children with safe accommodation. I think that's really important. I think that's well funded, and I believe at the time was warmly welcomed. And these extra investments will help trial and expand some new initiatives, which the evidence suggests can also make a significant impact into keeping women safe, and that's why we made those announcements as well.
Chancellor, you've heard we had a session yesterday. You've heard from Harriet about the impact on women. They've been hit very hard in this pandemic, and I've specifically highlighted the plight of women who need to be in refuges, and the supply is not as great as the need. So I just ask you to look at this in terms of the scale of what Women's Aid has spoken about, because it does feel like women's concerns are not being taken seriously enough, the impact on women in this pandemic and in terms of wider economic impacts, and not being taken seriously enough by this government. Just moving on to climate change. You amended the remit of the Monetary Policy Committee to reflect the importance of environmental sustainability and the transition to net zero, which is very welcome. So thank you for doing that. How do you hope that this will impact the MPC's decision making? And when will the remits of the Financial Conduct Authority and the Prudential Regulation Authority be amended?
So it's for the Bank of England to interpret the remit, and I think they have said that they will reflect on it and publish how they think it will allow them to do things differently. So it wouldn't be right for me to comment on that.
So the only thing that I would say is I know that the governor has previously said that he's interested in how they might adjust their approach to the corporate bond purchase scheme to be some more supportive of the transition to net zero, and indeed some other central banks have a regard to sustainability and net zero outcomes for some of their interventions. But as the Chancellor says, the specifics are for the bank to interpret, but that's certainly something the governor has said in the past.
Okay, well, you may not want to answer this question, but I'll try, Chancellor. Do you approve of monetary policy being used to discourage investment in carbon? And was the change in the remit designed to give the bank cover to do so?
I'd say I can't comment on monetary policy, and as the Bank of England governor said that they'll set out their approach given the change to the updating of the remit in due course.
Okay, well, I'm going to move on in that case to the international arena. Tackling climate change requires a global response. I was born in a country that is one of the most climate vulnerable in the world, and it's likely to face some 30 million climate refugees. The UK has got a very proud record, as Harriet mentioned, of international development contribution and cross-party agreements. That's been broken by you, in fact, because of your decision to cut the aid budget. You've stated that there are reasons for that, but it literally means slashing budgets, and it will lead to people dying. And it will undermine the effort to get developing countries to make the adaptations in relation to climate change and the mitigation. So can you explain why that is justified, and does it not undermine the net zero effect and our responsibilities to developing countries that also need to work to help to reduce carbon emissions and to protect people?
Well, what I'd say, it's not a decision that we took lightly, as I said at the time, and it's about priorities, and it's about facing the most difficult fiscal and economic circumstances that I think any government or the country has faced in a very long time, and responding to it in a way that we think is both responsible for the economy but also fair. And given that, we thought it was right to prioritise resources at this difficult time on things that we've just been talking about, whether it's domestic abuse, whether it's the NHS, whether it was social housing that Sean was talking about. Those are all priorities that we do have to also fund. And given we're in a difficult situation, I thought it was reasonable that we focused on those domestic priorities at this difficult time. But that doesn't mean at all that we are retrenching from being an incredibly active and generous country when it comes to supporting those who are vulnerable around the world. We will remain even at 0.5%, which is the equivalent of what we're spending this year, the second most generous G7 economy as a percentage of GDP. It will be significantly ahead of the 0.38 or 0.36% that the OECD average spends, and we will remain the largest donor to most international bodies. So whether it's things at the IMF, the World Bank, COVAX for vaccines and other things, and none of that takes into account the other things we do that are not included in the aid budget. For example, the peacekeeping operations that we conduct or the help we provide for asylum. But with regard to climate in particular, what the Foreign Secretary reiterated in his statement was that we remain committed to the same targets that we had before on international climate finance. I haven't got the numbers in my head, but I think it's a doubling of funding, and that is protected and remains an important part of what we will do to help. I just met Secretary Kerry this week to discuss that, which is a very positive meeting, and actually we are a leader we're a leader, I think, globally with our track record on this and the example that we've set, both by our actions and by our resources, and I think others will follow. The last thing I'd say is spending money is only one way to help. Innovation is also another way. And because of what the investments we're making in R&D to catalyze new technologies, and actually showing global leadership on things like disclosures through the G7, all of that is going to enormously help as well. And the budget talked about that. It talked about the disclosures, which I'm trying to champion through the G7 and G20 this year. Talked about carbon voluntary offset markets. I think there's a whole host of things we're doing which will make an enormous difference to countries around the world.
Some people would say slashing budgets by half in conflict zones is not going to help Britain's reputation and doesn't show a sign of leadership. So can I just ask, is this something that you expect to continue, keep the 0.5% level and enshrine it into law, or is it going to be a temporary change? Could you just clarify that?
Well, I think it can be both, because the Foreign Secretary said we'll bring forward legislation or appropriate legislation at the appropriate time. But we have also said it will be temporary, and that when the circumstances allow, we would aim to return back to the 0.7. But I think when you're talking about climate finance, this is just one of the many things we do in terms of getting funding into developing countries to help them tackle the challenges of climate change. Creating a high quality carbon offset market in the UK would also help do that. And what that will essentially do is unlock billions of private capital in developed worlds, and a well-functioning high quality market can channel that to other countries and help them do what they need to do as well. So, that's another way for us to show leadership, which will make a difference. And Clara First, who used to run the LSE, I'm delighted she's agreed to chair our working group on that, with an ambition that we make this the global leader for carbon offset trading, and that will unlock the capital that you rightly identify as needed.
Thank you.